Hey everybody, welcome to Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. I'm one of your hosts, Walter.
I'm your co-host Rob, and today we have Dr. Paul Copan, the Pledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics at I lost it. Palm Beach Atlantic University. Which has both an undergrad and graduate uh, courses. Dr. Copan specializes in obviously philosophy and ethics, and has written books such as "Is God a Moral Monster?" and "Is God a Vindictive Bully?" And we're gonna dive in to a bunch of that today. But first and foremost, most important question. I'll shoot Walter for our first and
Yeah,
most important question.
most important question. How do you take your coffee?
I take my coffee with cream and a little sweetener. So adulterated to some people, but I enjoy it. Like to add a little whipped cream
Nice.
on top as well.
Oh, whipped cream. Nice,
I
nice.
yeah.
I have multiple times made a hot cup of coffee and put a scoop of Bluebell ice cream. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that
I
Texas-based ice
am.
cream.
It's made right in Texas. Yeah. Been
Yes,
been been
sir.
past the Bluebell factory. Yep.
Okay, nice. Very good. Very good.
I see
So,
often dessert. I see a lot of desserts these days. It's like a double shot of espresso with a just a plump of vanilla ice cream, which sounds though a double
yeah.
shot of espresso for dessert at like 8 o'clock also sounds like
Oh
no
God.
sleep. So, um, Dr. Copan, what's your story? How did you become interested in philosophy and apologetics, and especially focusing on Old Testament?
Like I grew up in a Christian home. Dad was a pastor, so the Bible was always front and center for me. I did an undergrad in biblical studies at Columbia International University, and then went on to study at Trinity Seminary in Deerfield, Illinois, where I started a Master Divinity program. So I carried on in the biblical studies and theology uh, area, but I also happened to take an elective that first semester at Trinity with Stuart Hackett, a philosopher, and it was on religious epistemology. And this opened up a new horizon for me into philosophy, into Christian apologetics that I really hadn't really gotten into before. I mean, I had been familiar with apologetics, and it really been helpful for me in my faith when I was in high school. But then seeing the value of philosophy at a graduate level kind of helped me to step into that realm. And so I ended up taking on an additional master's degree in philosophy of religion, and William Lane Craig was one of my professors there at Trinity Seminary, and then went on to eventually to get a PhD in philosophy at Marquette University after having served on staff of the church in Schenectady, New York for 6.5 years. So anyway, it's been pretty much tied to the area of philosophy. But I've always had my hand in Old Testament stuff, but I started to get into the Old Testament ethical challenges after September 11th, when the new atheists like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and so forth were writing about the Old Testament God being the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. And so I wrote an article for the journal Philosophia Christi, Is Yahweh a Moral Monster?, which would eventually turn into the book Is God a Moral Monster?, which deals with some of these Old Testament ethical challenges. And then I went into kind of a follow-up book with Matthew Flanagan, Did God Really Command Genocide? And then kind of the third book in the trilogy, as it were, is God a Vindictive Bully, which deals with things like Elisha and the bears, and the striking down of Uzzah,
Yeah.
in the ark when he touched it, and the imprecatory Psalms, Jacob I've loved, Esau I've hated, God's hardening Pharaoh's heart, and so forth. So trying to deal with these issues in a way that takes biblical scholarship seriously, but also lays things out in a way that people in the pew can understand it readily.
And
Man.
when did you come on staff at the university?
I've been here since 2004, teaching at Palm Beach Atlantic University.
We have a sort of connection that my brother-in-law and Walter's former small group and friend
Oh yeah, Felipe Dovell is
Felipe
over at
Devale is now systematic chair at TEDS. Pretty cool. He was probably never there when you were there, but the TEDS connection is strong.
Okay, very good. Excellent. That's
nice.
great.
Oh, Okay, so one pre-question, and then go into the Garden of Eden. Is it real or allegorical? Do you prefer to say Yahweh when you discuss God, or just
God
curious about that?
the Lord God.
Yeah.
The Old Testament uses a number of different titles for God, so we can do the same.
Oh, okay. I was just curious. In my own I guess as I've gotten older, I've been like, man, should I when I pray, should I say the Lord God? Should I say Yahweh? What is it? Even teaching my daughters, be like, oh well,
Mhm.
here are the names of the Lord. There's
Yeah.
Yahweh and this. Anyway, so all right, so jumping to the Garden of Eden, from your experience or study or point of view, is the Garden of Eden real or is it allegorical?
Well, it is rooted in history. It is something that is given a geographic location, the Gihon and Pishon, Tigris and Euphrates rivers, we have, so I'd say that these are real. This is a real geographic location. And you see, say, the Tigris Euphrates rivers connected later on to God's workings in history of Israel, where you have the Tigris Euphrates rivers still there, and I see it as, even though there is a high degree of symbolism in, say, in the early chapters of Genesis, it is still rooted in history, just like as the Psalms speak poetically of certain historical events, they're still anchored in history.
Oh, I like that. It's anchored in history. Yeah, very good. So to the next one. Growing up, we assume that the eating of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was the sin itself. More mature in our confession, we can see now how the actual acceptance of that doubt is where the seed of sin is planted. And the fruit it bears is the act of defiance against God, the evil, as it were. This sets up the dichotomy of good as obedience to God and evil as disobedience. How do the promises laid out in the New Testament address our knowledge of evil? Woo! People submitted questions.
Okay, yeah. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I do think that when you look at I've written about this in my book, Loving Wisdom, where I talk about how human beings fell away from God, or kind of shifted their focus from God to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that became their focal point, and that this was the kind of the gradual process of losing sight of God as the great good. And then they prioritized, God made everything good, but they prioritized a creation of God rather than God himself. So God made everything good, but it was because of a disordered love or affection that shifted their focus. And Augustine talks about disordered loves and so forth, that when the ultimate becomes subordinate and the subordinate becomes ultimate, then this is what the scriptures call idolatry. But you see that sort of a thing in the New Testament as well, carrying over to love the Lord your God with heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. That ultimately the sin is a departure from that love of God and neighbor. So Jesus recapitulates what the Old Testament is talking about when you see that the commands that are given can be summed up in loving God and loving others. So you see that kind of a carryover. Jesus, of course, in the Sermon on the Mount, intensifies things by talking about, say, lust, by talking about anger, hateful anger. He's not saying that these are equal to the physical acts. He is saying that they are sinful as well, even though there are degrees of sin in Scripture. Jesus talks about the Jews committing the greater sin over, when he's talking to Pilate and so forth. So there are degrees of sin, intentional, unintentional, and so forth. But anyway, there's a kind of a quick summary, kind of trying to hit where I think maybe the person is going, but hopefully that helps.
We're going to take a quick break and have a word from a sponsor. Shenandoah Coffee Roasters has been a staple of Charlottesville since 1993. They offer over 25 varieties of specialty, boutique, and gourmet coffee using only the finest Arabia coffee from all over the world. Coffee is their passion, and they painstakingly search out the best coffee available. Nothing is taken for granted as they continually strive to provide the best coffee they possibly can. They roast all their coffees to order based on the needs of their espresso bar, ensuring that only the freshest and highest quality coffee leaves their roasting house. Grab a cup at any of their 3 locations: Main Restaurant Preston, On the Corner, or on Ivy Road. Or order a bag online at shenandoahjoe.com.
Yes, hope, yeah. So Yahweh describes himself as a jealous God. That's often portrayed as negative. Is it positive, and in what way is it actually positive?
Well, it's positive in the sense that it is a righteous passion exhibited when there is a violation of a covenant relationship, for example. In marriage,
Yeah, yeah,
if a man is flirting with a woman, or a woman is flirting with a man, the wife sees it, that is, and she gets jealous, that is a righteous jealousy. That is appropriate. That there should
yes,
not be a third party intruding upon the intimacy of a marriage. And so God, who's made a covenant with Israel, when there are idolatrous tendencies or sexual immorality or something like that, these are the sorts of things that arouse God's jealousy, because it is putting God's substitutes in place of the one true God who has delivered the Israelites from Egypt and so forth. He's shown his grace to them. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. So there's grace, and then there's the response of gratitude and obedience.
yeah. That's good. Yeah, this morning in our devotion with my daughters, we read, "Hey, I'm the Lord your God. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Here's what it means to love me or follow me." Went through the 10 Commandments. So this is both the Old Testament and I think a little bit of a New Testament question. What's up with all the weird laws like kosher foods and clothing distinctiveness? And what is this random passage where Paul is like, "Don't eat the blood of animal," or it's something like that. Me and my wife were discussing that the other day. We're like, "What is this randomness? Do I need to eat kosher food from now on as a Christian?"
Okay. All right. Well, a few things here, and I go into this in my book, Is God a Moral Monster, where I lay out some of these details. But the kosher foods are part of a larger set of commands by which the Israelites are to set themselves apart or be set apart in every aspect of life. That they are to, in their diet, in their clothing, they're not to have different fibers in their clothing. They're not to plant different crops in the same field. Why is this? Well, it's a picture of not being mixed in with the other nations. Israel is to be distinctive and not blended in, as it were, with the other nations. And so kosher foods, it's not as though these are inherently bad, because everything that God made is good. And the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 4 says that everything that God made is good, and that nothing is to be prohibited if it's received with gratitude in prayer. So this is what Paul is highlighting, and Jesus himself, he declares all foods clean in the Gospel of Mark, that it's not what goes into a person that defiles him, but what comes out from the heart. So these kosher foods are something that are not intrinsically problematic, but they're a temporary measure that is for Israel to remind them that even in their diet, they're to be the set apart people of God. There's more to it than that, but that's kind of the basic structure. But I lay out more details in my book, Is God a Moral Monster?
Yeah, I
Okay,
like that.
And then when
Oh
we
yeah,
get
go
to
ahead.
Paul, I mean, when you talk about Paul, I mean, of course, he in 1 Timothy chapter 4 doesn't prohibit the actual eating of any foods, but it's a matter of conscience. Romans chapter 14, 1 Corinthians 8 and 10. So foods are not, there's not a mandate about what you ought to eat, but in the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15, there is the request that to pass on to the Gentiles, to stay away from things that are highly offensive to Jews, so, so that you, as the Jews and Gentiles in Christ, are coming together and learning to live with each other in community, that you are aware of these sensitivities like sexual immorality. I mean, it's wrong in and of itself, but being highly attuned to that in light of the Jewish sensitivities to that, and also meat offered to idols, meat with the blood in it, and so forth. This is prohibited in the Old Testament law, and so there's to be a respectfulness about that. So anyway, those are kind of initial strictures that seem to be later on loosened up a little bit as the church is growing. And so Paul doesn't highlight those sorts of things. It's like as the church is growing, then those things are loosened. And if you eat meat offered to idols, that's okay. There's nothing intrinsically wrong, but being careful not to offend someone who might be sensitized to that.
That was a very good answer. Thank you, Dr. Copan. This next one's sort of a two-parter, so I'll do the first part, which kind of leads into the second. Was the Torah liberal or progressive for this time, especially say in comparison with the Code of Hammurabi?
Yeah. Well, of course, liberal and progressive can sound a little bit loaded. But we can talk about, I think maybe something like moral advancement would probably be a good way of looking at it. And I would say, in my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? I devote 3 chapters to these specifics and kind of add on to it in other chapters, where you look at the worldview of the Old Testament, and you see human beings made in the image of God. You see male and female equality. You see a highly democratized law system or collection that emphasizes the fundamental equality that all people have before the law: the prophet, the priest, the king, the ordinary citizen. When your brother does this, it's not as though when a nobleman does this, then there's a certain penalty that goes along with that. But when someone who is lower on the social ladder does it, then there's a stiffer penalty. That was common in the surrounding ancient Near Eastern societies, but not in Israel law. That you have a fundamental equality, that everyone is responsible before God, that there are not these kind of people getting easy passes or something like that, while others, get harsh punishments. This is something that is to be, fundamentally, it's to be meted out to all people accordingly. So there is that, democratized understanding. You also have things like the Sabbath law, which is unique in the ancient Near East, where the Israelites have rest from their labors, where you have also laws that provide for the poor, gleaning laws, or no interest loans for the poor, and many other things that, or even care for the foreigner, which was unusual in Israel, that this was to be a special concern for the Israelites in light of the narrative of the Israelites having been delivered from Egypt, where they were foreigners in that land. And so you see mentioned 36 times, for you were once strangers or aliens in the land of Egypt. And this is to inform how they treat the strangers in their midst. So again, you do see a remarkable worldview contrast here. So there is certainly an elevated moral picture when you look at the law of Moses, in contrast to the worldview assumptions that are typified in these other law collections of Hammurabi and so forth.
And especially with today, and I know you mentioned New Atheist earlier, Sam Harris has really, or has at least in the past, really hammered away at this point. But for this kind of democratization, equalization, especially treatment of the foreigner, what can we know when we discuss slavery in the Bible, both in the Torah and in some of the Pauline epistles? What can we learn about how slavery was allowed in both testaments, and how can we apply it today? It's not me saying we should re-enslave people, but taking perhaps the moral context of the time and how to apply it.
Yeah. I would say that the question here is one of word usage for one thing. The term slave and slavery in Scripture is an unfortunate translation or rendering because it is more like someone like a servant would be perhaps an appropriate translation, or worker, because the term itself is neutral. You can, in the book of Exodus, and I talk about this in my Vindictive Bully book quite a bit. In the book of Exodus, God, the Israelites are, of course, they're slaves of Pharaoh. There's harsh treatment and so forth. So that's the negative rendering. That's a negative understanding of servitude. But God says to tell, he tells Moses to tell Pharaoh, let my people go that they may do what? Serve me in the wilderness. That is, they've been liberated and they are now in a dynamic dependency relationship with God, in a covenant relationship with him. And that is seen as freedom, liberation. So, but when you look at the term slave, that sounds readily inherently negative to us, and obviously, given our history, it's understandable why. And so that's why I think that some of the translations that we have use that term slave to that term, that is very misleading to people. And when we look at servitude in the Old Testament, for example, we see that you have rights that servants have, that if a servant is struck so that dies, the one who struck him, his employer, I think that's probably a better, someone who's contracted out to contract, or a 6-year kind of contract, and the 7th year he goes free. So it's an indentured servitude. And so the contract is valid, and this person who is working for this employer lives in his home, gets food, clothing, shelter. Often his family is incorporated into this sort of a setting because that person can't sustain himself. It's because of poverty, not because of kidnapping or something, that someone is brought into servitude. So it is there's a dependency here, but it's also that person, once that person is released from that contract, once that contract expires, then the person goes about as the normal everyday citizen in Israel would. But what's interesting too, but if a servant is struck so that he dies by this employer, then he is to be punished. That term is used of capital punishment. It is kind of, he'll be avenged. And if the servant is just a piece of furniture, well, that's kind of that wouldn't make sense. It only makes sense if the servant is actually a human being who bears the image of God. And so you have that kind of a stricture. You also have the possibility of even a servant saying, I love my employer, the person who has taken me in, and he wants to be a permanent servant. And so there's a ceremony in Exodus 21 that talks about that. So this is a voluntary servitude that continues for the rest of his life. Well, can you call that slavery? That doesn't sound like slavery as people commonly associate with it. This is something that is freely chosen. Furthermore, we also have another text that is also a kind of a subversive text when it comes to the whole question of, quote, of slavery or servitude, that you can have foreign runaway slaves who come to Israel, and the Israelites are to allow them to settle in any of the Israelite cities. That is, they have this freedom to settle rather than to be sent back to their masters, which, say, the Babylonian Cone of Hammurabi insisted that if someone runs away from Babylon, he ought to be brought back. And if you're harboring him, you could be capitally punished. So here's this law of freedom, of runaway, that you can get out of a harsh servitude and find freedom, rest, peace in the land of Israel. So fundamentally, any sort of, quote, institutionalization of servitude has this element of freedom to run away, freedom to align yourself voluntarily to be a servant in someone's household, a contracted worker for the rest of your life. So really, it guts the notion of any notion of slavery, that kind of vocabulary, which is, so we're seeing something far different here than what we have going on in the antebellum or pre-Civil War South. So it's radically different, and I go into a lot of detail in my Vindictive Bully book, and I look at passages like Leviticus 25, which people often bring up, and I unpack that. And a lot of the language that's used of the Israelite servant is also is applied to the foreign servant, who can actually become a person of means and actually even hire an Israelite servant to work for him as a foreigner. So it's kind of interesting how that works. But also I would add, in the New Testament you have servants or slaves in the Roman Empire. Again, it's different from Old Testament servitude, but in the Roman Empire you have the institutionalization of slavery. You do have some benefits, like you can buy yourself out of servitude, and the Apostle Paul says if you can find your freedom in 1 Corinthians 7 to go ahead and do that. He also urges that Philemon for his, again, if Onesimus is a runaway slave. And again, there's question about that. And I talk about that also in my Moral Monster book. But if he's truly a runaway slave, Paul admonishes him to take him in as a brother, not as a slave. And so that's something that's also significant. But it's interesting that even slaves are urged in the Christian community to work hard, to work with integrity and so forth. But masters are also called upon to remember that they have a master in heaven who will hold them accountable for how they treat their slaves. And you also have in the New Testament, in Romans chapter 16, you have Urbanus and Andronicus, two common slave names. So they're in the church in Rome, and you have other people like Aquila and Priscilla, who are kind of upper class. The church meets in their home and so forth. But there too, Romans 16:16 says, "Greet one another with a holy kiss." Well, here's an expression of family. You've got those who are free, you've got those who are slaves, but they're to greet one another with a holy kiss. And Paul talks about the Andronicus and Urbanus as being fellow servants, fellow workers of his. So he sees this fundamental equality within the kingdom. So Paul is treating them with that equality, to treat them, to greet one another with a holy kiss. That's a language of family. You also see that the slave and master were sitting at the Lord's Supper together. They'd eat meals together and then celebrate the Lord's Supper, is a picture of equality, the fundamental equality, master and slave sitting side by side, partaking in the Lord's Supper. So you have something very subversive going on in the New Testament itself. And of course, Jesus is opposed to any sort of oppression or harsh treatment of others when he says in Luke chapter 4 that he's come to set prisoners free, to bring, to heal the brokenhearted and so forth, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. So he is one who is all about not oppressing others, but actually setting them free.
Great answer. Thank you.
So, no, fantastic answer. And I love it when people can explain the difference between slavery or bondservant or worker and stuff. So the slaughter of the Canaanites ordered by God in the New Testament is something often brought up as a direct example of the Old Testament God's attitude, especially when juxtaposed with Jesus in the gospel. How true is that? How do you unpack that?
Well, a few things to say here, and indeed books can be written on this, but here's a reminder. The primary command, of course, is to drive out the Canaanites, and of course, if the Canaanites resist, then they open themselves up to harm. But you also have 400 or over 500 years of divine waiting, where God waits for the sin of the Canaanites to be filled up. So he is waiting for for the sin to reach full ripening before God finally says that's it. So it's not as though this is some sort of a precipitous judgment or precipitous action. God is waiting, and it would have been wrong for the Israelites to come in earlier to drive out the Canaanites. We do see the emphasis on driving out, over against. And again, the question is, how do we translate the term haram, sometimes rendered utterly destroy? Because there are places where you just see a mighty victory going on, or even a slight victory, but we're told that the opposition was, quote, utterly destroyed. And we know from ancient Near Eastern culture that was like trash talk in war texts. Yeah, we totally destroyed that team. We totally destroyed those guys. There wasn't anybody alive that breathed. This is just the vocabulary of ancient Near Eastern warfare. Even if you took a big hit in your fighting and barely eked out a victory, you still described it as we utterly destroyed them. What's different about the scriptures is that when you have that language of, again, how do you translate it, utterly destroy? Sometimes it just means a decisive victory. Sometimes it even just means exile without any killing. So I go into details on that, but I can say that you have the scriptures mentioning, alongside the, quote, destruction texts or no survivor texts, you have sometimes in the same chapter or later on in the book mention of lots of survivors in that same city. So you have, we have in that language that's used in Numbers 21, where these two kings, Sihon and Og, are, their armies are wiped out, or at least defeated. That's probably a safer way to Deuteronomy. And it uses that kind of sweeping terminology, man, woman, young and old, even though when you read the original text, it just says the king, his sons, and his army were fighting. There weren't any non-combatants there. It was just combatants. But then Deuteronomy kind of amplifies that and uses that kind of rhetoric, which was common in the ancient Near East, that sweeping, totalizing rhetoric that is used. And so anyway, I go into lots of details on these sorts of things. But let me just say this about the New Testament. When you look at the Acts chapter 13, Paul's speech, you look at Hebrews chapter 13, or sorry, Hebrews 11, and you also you see that the Canaanite wars are commented on, but it's seen as God's deliverance and God's judgment on wicked people. That they engaged in incest, bestiality, ritual prostitution, infant sacrifice, things that would be considered, criminal in any modern society. And so, as we look at the New Testament, we see that this was kind of a dovetailing of God giving the land to the Israelites, but also bringing judgment upon people who were wicked. And I should add this: they're also significantly stronger than the Israelites. They're more numerous. They had walled cities that were scary and daunting, and it was also a fearful thing. That's why Joshua is told, don't be afraid, for I'm with you. Don't be dismayed, for I'm your God. That sort of a thing. I will be with you wherever you go. Joshua chapter 1. Well, why? Because the Canaanites were more numerous, were militarily superior. So it was an act of faith, of trust in God, to actually fight against these Canaanites. So it wasn't as though the Israelites were this militarily superior nation coming in and devastating the Canaanites. It was a scary thing, and they had to trust in God. And so you see some, as you look at all of these pieces, you see something going on. And I'd add this: Jesus, we read in Jude chapter 5, our best New Testament manuscripts say Jesus, after he had delivered the Israelites from Egypt, destroyed those who did not believe. This is Jesus here. So it's looking at the Old Testament through a Trinitarian or Christological lens, that the triune God is involved in judgment. The triune God, Jesus himself, is involved in bringing judgment upon these rebellious Israelites. We see Jesus again in red letters in the book of Revelation, saying that he is going to cast Jezebel on a bed of sickness, this false prophetess. He's going to strike dead her followers. So you see that there is a severity to Jesus. And one of the things that I point out in my Vindictive Bully book, emphasizing Romans 11:22, behold then the kindness and severity of God. So we can't just say, oh, severity, that's in the Old Testament, kindness in the New. No, Paul is saying kindness and severity in both. Yeah. Jesus is one who says, come to me, who labor, I will give you rest. Jesus is one who doesn't break a bruised reed or snuff out as one who will rule the nations with a rod of iron.
Yeah. Man, man, I love it. I
All
think
right,
it's
that was our
yeah.
Old Testament section. Now let's move on to the New Testament.
I've been trying to bring them both together here, though, just so you
Yeah,
know.
we gotta dovetail this. What is the difference, if any, especially by like online commentators and the new atheists that we've already mentioned previously, um, often try to heighten so-called difference between the God of the Old and New Testament. Is
Right.
there a difference? If so, is that meaningful, or is it a progression of understanding, or is it just totally a misunderstanding and misreading by Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and other online skeptics?
Right. Yeah, one of the things that I try to bring out in my Vindictive Bully book, I try to show how these portrayals of God in the Old and New Testaments can be reconciled. And I challenge people like Greg Boyd, the theologian, or Eric Seibert or Peter Enns, who are actually distinguishing between what they call as the textual God of the fallen ancient Near Eastern author or narrator or prophet like Moses or Joshua or whatever, and the actual God who is kind and loving and revealed in Jesus Christ on the cross when he says, Father, forgive them that don't know what they're doing. That this God of the Old Testament doesn't engage in enemy love. This God of the Old Testament, or at least the textual God, is not seen as someone who, as a being who is, is. Yeah, well, let me just back that up. They would these, people like Greg Boyd would say, if it says, "Thus says the Lord," don't always believe it. That could just be the textual God here. That could be just the voice of Moses, who is violence prone, who is kind of barbaric, who is part of this fallen culture. And so this is just echoing his own worldview rather than what the Lord really said. And so Moses is misinterpreting what is going on. And what's interesting is that both the Old and the New Testaments tell us that no, Moses is one who is speaking with God face to face. The end of Deuteronomy tells us that he's speaking as someone who is in tune with God rather than someone who's out of touch with God and mistaking what God's message is. And of course, the New Testament tells us that Moses is one who is faithful in all of God's household. And so you have a consistent portrayal of Moses. It's not as though, oh, Moses was commanding something that was bad, but now in the New Testament, and that is made clear in the New Testament. No, there's a consistency there. And as I go through, say, somebody like a Greg Boyd, where he says, this is the textual God, this is the textual God, this is the textual God, because it's not kind, it's not loving, or something like that, or that Jesus is somehow repudiating certain things of the Old Testament. As we look more closely, and even the New Testament is often affirming this, that where Greg Boyd says that the textual God and the actual God are, quote, quite distinct, it's because there's a lot of selectivity going on here that Greg Boyd overlooks a lot of passages that actually show that the textual God and the actual God at those places would actually be identical. And so he's kind of obfuscated this in creating a chasm between the testaments, where the New Testament itself makes very clear that there is not this kind of a chasm that people like Greg Boyd are espousing. So we see Jesus as one who, yes, he reveals the Father, John 14:9, the one who has seen me has seen the Father. But we also see that the Father is severe. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 talks about these judgments coming upon the Israelites because of their grumbling, because of their unbelief, because of their sexual immorality, because of their idolatry. So there is a carryover that the New Testament is affirming these sorts of things, these kinds of judgments upon the Israelites because of their disobedience. So that severity is being acknowledged, and that they're reinforcing the fact that the Old Testament God and the New Testament God, the one true God, is severe upon those who rebel against him, those who are ungrateful against those who engage in sexual immorality and idolatry and so forth. And as I've said, you have Jesus, who is actually striking dead, destroying those who were who had come out of Egypt but yet were grumbling in the wilderness and so forth. So we see that there is this kind of a continuity. So there are differences. Of course, the ancient Israel, we see them as a nation with boundaries, with civil courts, with punishments, with even eventually a military and a king. And the nation is to be conducting itself under the rule of God. But you get to the New Testament, you have the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham that all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And so we have an interethnic community of God's people where we have, say, church discipline instead of judicial courts and so forth to go to. We have where we have certain things that are no longer practiced because we are all a kingdom of priests, and so we offer up spiritual sacrifices like our bodies, Romans chapter 12, or our good deeds, or the fruit of our lips, our praises to God, Hebrews 13, or sharing our faith with others, that the Gentiles come in, that is also an aspect of our priesthood, as Paul talks about in Romans chapter 15, that all of these things, Philippians chapter 4, offering up gifts to God, sacrificial gifts for the kingdom of God. These are seen as a fragrant offering to God. So we have a spiritual service to offer God. We offer up spiritual sacrifices that through Jesus Christ, these promises to God, through these pictures of the priesthood are fulfilled in Jesus Christ, but yet we share in that kind of a connection to God, that access that we have through offering up spiritual sacrifices to God. So there are differences that are there, but you also see that they're built on what has gone on in the Old Testament, that we are seen as the fulfillment of the temple of God in the Old Testament, that we are, as believers, seen as those who are the true Israel, that are because we're connected to Jesus. Old Testament Israel, they're called a vine that had been transplanted from Egypt, as the Psalms tell us. Psalm 89. And so you have, or Psalm 80, where you have this, but now we are the branches of the true vine, Jesus, who is the one who lives out ancient Israel's story faithfully, that he is the one who is the obedient son that ancient Israel failed to be. And by virtue of our connection to him, we are the new Israel and so forth. So anyway, those are a few things that we can talk about, but there is definitely this kind of a continuity, even though there are aspects of discontinuity, but it's not as though there is a God of the Old Testament versus the God of the New.
Yeah.
Great.
I do find it interesting, just saying this real quick, that it's the son that Israel couldn't be, this massive group of people, but then it's Jesus who's the true son, who's an this individual. It just right now just made me think of like, oh yeah, a bunch of people couldn't do it, but one man, God man could.
Yeah.
That's kind of awesome. So
yeah, and what you see here is there is even as you look at the Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7, there is a rule that he has as this one who comes to the Ancient of Days and is one who is granted rule and authority over the nations and so forth. But you also see that the saints who belong to him also share in that rule with the Messiah. And so you have the individual, but also the corporate dimension too. So that's that language of the new man in Christ, that there is, that we are participating in this, as Christ as the new, the new Adam, the second Adam, that we belong to a new humanity because of him, that we belong to a new covenant community, kind of after the new Exodus. Through Jesus Christ, who is out of Egypt I've called my son. So we belong to that obedient son, and so there is that one. He is the faithful Israelite who fulfills the promises and carries out the task, the vocation of ancient Israel, but does so faithfully as an obedient son that ancient Israel was not.
That was another very we like
fire,
dense,
baby,
good,
fire.
long answers to questions here. No skirting around the bush. I love it. The next question we had prepared kind of dovetailed into your answer from the previous. We'll just skip that one. And what is the significance of Isaac's binding, both in the Old Testament cultural context and as a point in the New Testament's theology?
Well, there is of course, a prefiguring of what is going on with Isaac, and Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 8, and also Hebrews. The author of Hebrews in chapter 11 talks about this as well. But let me just first back up and give a little bit of the historical aspect to it. Of course, some people say, oh, how could God command the sacrifice of Isaac? That was, for another person it would be murder, but why does Abraham? Why is it obedience for him? Why is it an act of faith for him to do so? Well, a few things to keep in mind here. One is that God has had a friendship with Abraham for decades. So this has been something that's been going on for a long time. Abraham has been walking with God for quite a while. It's not as though one night out of the blue, God's, some voice comes to Abraham and says, do this. No, this has been happening. A lot's been happening between God and Abraham for a long, long time. And so this is simply the continuity of that story. And a lot of people simply rip that story out of context and forget that there is a whole narrative that has lasted for decades that informs what is going on with Abraham, and that God, in his providence, in his miraculous working, brings about a miracle child of Isaac from the bodies of Abraham and Sarah. And so it is through Isaac that the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. So Abraham, trusting in the promise of God, knows that Isaac is going to be the means of blessing through his offspring, of course, to all the nations of the earth. Well, how is that going to happen if God is telling him to sacrifice this miracle child? And that God has been speaking to Abraham over the course of decades. Well, what is Abraham to do? Well, he says, as they're going to Mount Moriah, and he tells his servants, he says, we will go and worship, and we will return. He believes, he is confident that Isaac will accompany him back. Doesn't know how it's going to happen. God's got to work it out. But he is trusting that he's trusting the promise of God that he's going to do it. And that's why the author of Hebrews 11 says that Abraham was one who believed that God could even raise the dead. He was confident that God was going to work it out, even if it meant raising Isaac from the dead, so that the promise that came to Abraham, that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through his offspring, that it would be fulfilled. Also, we see in the New Testament, of course, Hebrews 11 talks about how he was a type of Christ, and so we see this as someone who was offered up, and yet, of course, is as it were raised from the dead. But we also see in Romans chapter 8, which uses the language of Genesis chapter 22, that God, who did not spare his own son. Again, God told Abraham, because you have not spared your son, your only son whom you love. That language is applied to Jesus, but of course, God, Jesus was not spared, but he gave his life for us all. So God goes the distance, as it were, and by Jesus himself voluntarily laying down his own life so that we would be rescued, that we would be redeemed, that it was his life for our, his laying down of his life so that we would live and have life with God. So what we have here is not, there's not a ram that's being a substitute for Isaac here. Here it is Jesus himself who is the substitute for us, that we would be reconciled to God. So there's a lot to unpack there, but there's perhaps in brief something to think about.
All right. I think, Walter, since we're coming up on some time, do you want to just ask your question? And Dr.
Yeah.
Copan, I don't know what time frame you're on, but we'll stay and answer at least a few of these next questions as possible.
Yeah. Dr. Copan, do you this is not on there, so I apologize. It just popped up in my head. Do you have any experience with discussing communion? The whole Jesus, I am with you. Is this figuratively, this is my this is my body, this is my blood, right? Do you ever dive into any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I do discuss these sorts of things with people, and there are people from different communions who have who have differing ideas on this. Whether you're talking about Catholics or Lutherans, or like maybe the more Baptistic congregations that see it as a memorial. I think that the representation of the more Reformed tradition, I think, captures something that, say, First Corinthians chapter 10 talks about, that to receive the body and blood of Christ is to participate in it's a participation of fellowship with him. It's like a coming together. It's a spiritual communion, a spiritual nourishment, not it's not something where the elements are changed.
Right.
Yeah, or I say that unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you'll not have eternal life. Well, just earlier in John chapter 6, he's been talking about believing in him, receiving him. So it's not talking about communion there. It's not talking about, he uses the word flesh rather than body. But also, even with Jesus at the Last Supper, he says, "This is my body." Well, of course, Jesus hasn't even been crucified; he hasn't died yet. And are there two bodies? I mean, is the bread an additional body to the body of Christ that is sitting at the table with the disciples? I think that there are a number of problems that go along with this, and a lot can be unpacked here. But I do see that there is something that happens, but it is a kind of a spiritual coming together, a spiritually momentous time where you come together and sit down with the Lord at the table. And so I think that is probably the extent of what is going on. I think it's more than a memorial. I do think that there is does say it is a fellowship, it is a communion. And so there is something, I think, that does transpire there, but not in terms of the transformation of the elements, say, or the like.
Yeah, no, that was good. I think I've been on my own journey of understanding. It's like it's not just because I grew up Baptist, missionary Baptist. This ye do it in remembrance of me, memorial, versus understanding like, no, like there's actually something happening spiritually. Like, no, somehow Jesus is present, or Jesus is like, I'm communing with with Yahweh as we participate in communion.
I think the Eastern Orthodox in general, I think, has the simplest answer to this, is that it is a mystery. It is a great mystery.
There's that, yeah.
Which I think the rest of the Protestants and Catholics also agree, but the Eastern Orthodox are just kind of like, it's a mystery, period. And the rest of us are like, it's a mystery. What's the mystery? Let's solve it.
Let's solve this mystery.
That's good.
We're
gonna leave it.
Yeah, we're gonna. Okay. Hey, I'm gonna have to.
You're gonna.
I'm gonna have to. Yeah, I'm sorry, Dr. Copan. Thank you for chatting with us. I apologize. I got to get to a job site so stuff doesn't burn down.
Okay. All right.
And
sounds good.
I'll ask one or two more questions if that's all right.
Okay. Sounds good. Copan. Sounds good. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, Walter, you can say goodbye to everyone. Everyone else listening, we'll stay on for a few more questions. How does the role of free will play in the existence of evil and suffering? Asked another way, how does the presence of evil and the concept of free choice relate? I think a lot of people have, like, are we robots? I would answer no. But what free will do we have if the universe, whether deterministic by science or predestination by God, like, how does just all that kind of interweave beautifully or messily?
Yeah. Well, I would say that free will is important. We see that this in the garden. Human beings get to choose between aligning themselves with God, trusting in his word, or trusting the word of a stranger, trusting in their own wisdom, kind of a flawed perspective, and getting things wrong. But I think that ultimately, when it comes to the problem of evil, obviously things are sent spiraling because of human rebellion against God. That God does give to human beings freedom to, as C.S. Lewis said, freedom to say to God, "Thy will be done," or God says to human beings, "Thy will be done." We have a choice to do it our own way or to do it God's way. And I think that even in the existence of evil, C.S. Lewis said that pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world, and that this is a way of awakening us to our own sin, to our own finitude, to our own insufficiency, and that it's a way of getting our attention. Rather than shielding us from the consequences of our own brokenness and alienation from God, God allows us to be exposed to it. Sometimes there are, of course, many horrific stories that go along with this, throughout history. But rather than shielding us from the reality of human alienation from God, there is this opportunity that human beings have to see that they need outside assistance, they need grace, and so in the free response to God's grace that He affords us, there is the opportunity to align ourselves with God and to find ultimately in union with God perfect happiness. And so that may involve all sorts of terrible things that happen to us on this earth. You look at Paul in 2 Corinthians, where he is talking about his beatings, his shipwrecks, all sorts of persecution that he's experiencing. But he talks about these light momentary afflictions. So he sees these in contrast to the greater goodness of perfect happiness with God, of perfect joy in God's presence, and that these are often ways of getting us aligned with God and recognizing we need to cling to God. We need to cling to a God who steps into this evil world and faces evil himself in the person of Jesus Christ. So we have actually an anchor, a connecting point for the reality of the cross, to point us to the fact that, as Paul says, in this world, or Jesus says, in this world you will have trouble. Or Paul says, in Acts 14, we must go through many tribulations to enter the kingdom of God. Well, if you're thinking that there's got to be we've got to have a pass on these things because we're Christians, that's just not a realistic picture. Jesus himself said, if they hated me, they're going to hate you. If they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. And so we're not shielded from these things, but it is an opportunity for us to align ourselves with God, to, even if it means going through trouble, that perfect happiness with God is something that is the outcome for those who freely respond to God's grace and put their trust in Him and say, your will be done rather than my will be done.
Awesome. Secular polemists often accuse religion of being the root of all evil and violence, from women to outright genocide. Christian fundamentalists often answer the question back with that it's secular ideologies that have killed more people than the rest of history combined. Both of these attacks seem not to be really winning any converts, only entrenching sides. What would be a more nuanced and charitable answer for both sides? What is wrong and right about maybe both of those questions and reports and accusations?
Yeah. Well, I think that in this whole question about, I think you're right to point out that whatever the quote ideology or religion, a lot of people even looking at their own, you think of Jesus, who in Matthew chapter 7, where he says, many people saying to me, Lord, Lord, didn't we do these things in your name? And Jesus will say, like prophesying, casting out demons, etc., doing miracles. And Jesus will say, depart from me, I never knew you, you workers of lawlessness. So you have this picture of, a lot of people can take the label of quote religion or Christianity or something like that. And the problem is the human heart. Ultimately, it's not there's sometimes these secular ideologues will say, oh, religion does this. Well, of course, we talk about how secular ideologies like communism or whatever have done all sorts of damage. They have brought great violence and harm and so forth. So it's not as though you can tidily.
My favorite kind of
Go ahead.
refutation of the Christians fighting against the secularists, or even the secularists against the um, Christians, is like, well, Hitler was vegetarian. Are all vegetarians like genocidal maniacs? Like, I don't think so, right? Like, obviously not. But at the same
Yeah,
time, it's like,
sure.
you know, not the
Yeah.
greatest poster child for your movement either.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say that a lot of people complain about hypocrites in the church. Well, the question of hypocrisy presupposes that there is an authentic representation, and so that's why we say, well, look at Jesus. What you ultimately you have to deal with Jesus, not with hypocrites in the church. That he is the one who is the true, the authentic, the one who actually truly represents who God is. And so, even when you look at, say, a lot of people say, "Oh, look at Islam. Who are you to say that this is what Islam really is?" Well, just look at Muhammad. Let's start there. That's a fair starting place, and compare, say, how Jesus treats women and how Muhammad treats women. Look at how they actually conduct themselves with regard to their own relationships, and you see a marked contrast. So, if you got to make a judgment, go with the original source, and then kind of pair things out from there. Kind of see, I mean, obviously Muhammad was seeing himself as the prophet of God and speaking truth and so forth, and that Muslims see him as the ultimate paradigm of virtue and so forth. Well, just step back and look a little bit and see, how does he actually treat women. Look at the traditions, and you see how cruel and how sexually active he is in his to demonstrate his own sexual prowess of having sex with multiple wives at night and so forth, and how, or even having sex with slave women that was permitted by Muhammad, which he himself engaged in. So you see Jesus as someone who is far removed from any sort of using of women. He treats women with dignity and respect and so forth. So look to the original article when it comes to these sorts of things, and make those kinds of judgments. But when it comes to who speaks for who speaks for Christianity, who speaks for Islam, well, just look at the founders, and that will give you a lot of guidance. But be careful about simply saying, "Oh, these Christians do this in the name of Jesus." Well, would Jesus approve of these things? And I think a lot of times the question answers itself.
Yeah, I would also encourage both sides, but especially the secular critic, that just saying, religion is X or Christianity is Z. Most religious people these days are not white; they are black and brown and Asian,
Hmm.
and you run the risk real quick of sounding more bigoted than you already are. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, Christianity, I think, is now only 15% white. Of course, Islam is maybe also 15% white, if
oh
not
yeah,
considerably
big
less.
shift.
And
Yeah,
same with Buddhism or
yeah,
Jainism. I mean, I think a lot of secular
yeah,
critics rolling religion uh, in there are probably only thinking about white evangelical
yeah,
fundamental Western Christians, but at the same time, you're the one posing the question, not that. But
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Good word. Yeah.
um, let's wrap up here with a few little exclude questions. Who are some rigorous Christian scientists or ethicists or philosophers, I guess, that've written books for popular audiences? Do you recommend? Of course, other than
Yeah.
yourself.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think that someone like William Craig has done great work in his Reasonable Faith website, and just has been a great resource for a lot of people. So, if you're looking for some great work on apologetics, Christian philosophy, theology, even from I think a paradigm case, here is William Lane Craig does great work. J.P. Moreland, again, doing excellent work in the area of Christian philosophy. So yeah, those are Alvin Plantinga has been such a great pioneer in these areas of Christian philosophy. He's at the end of his career, but has done such great pioneering work that has inspired many of us who have followed in his footsteps. So, those are just a few names there.
Which critic of Christianity do you take most seriously, or at least which critical question of theism do you think is most worth wrestling with?
Yeah, well, I think the problem of evil is probably the weightiest question. Of course, it has different manifestations, like the divine hiddenness question, or the question of the unevangelized, or the question of, say, hell as separation from God. These are all manifestations of the problem of evil. But I think that is the ultimate question that Christians have to answer. But on the other side of the equation, everybody has to address that question. And the issue is really which worldview makes the best sense of the problem of evil. And as you look at other alternative worldviews, they don't have the resources that the Christian faith has in addressing the problem of evil. You don't have what is the basis for human dignity, which is often assumed by people who talk about the problem of evil, that, how could God allow this earthquake? Human beings have dignity and worth. Where does that dignity come from in the absence of God? If we're just simply the products of blind materialistic forces that are valueless, where does value come from? So the Christian faith has an array of answers to the questions of, even giving a frame of reference for goodness itself. Evil presupposes that there's a departure from the way things ought to be. Why ought things to be any different if, say, there is no God? Also, we have a God who steps into our world, who gets his feet dirty and hands bloody, who shows us the way, of even dealing with the evil in our own hearts by providing grace for us to be reconciled to God and to change us from within. And that God guarantees don't have the same fate. They don't just die and that's the end of the story. No, cosmic justice will be done. And the atheist version of things, there will be no cosmic justice. That just will never happen. People get away with murder millions of times over, and that's it, over and out, end of story. And so anyway, the Christian faith, yes, does have to grapple with the problem of evil, but so does every other worldview. And the question really remains, which worldview has the best resources for dealing with that? And the Christian faith certainly does.
Awesome. And one last question. I own quite a few of your books, but are there any projects that you're working on or upcoming lectures? I know in the green room we were talking about you're coming to Charlottesville actually in 2024, and you'll be in, I believe, San Antonio this fall for another presentation. What are some articles, books, lectures that's coming up that you find anything you just want to self-promote a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm contributing to a book on the moral argument, and I'm dealing with the problem of evil and the moral argument for God's existence, and dealing with another book, co-editing a book called Christianity Contested, which will be coming out next year, and it has to do with challenges of the Christian faith, related to male-female equality, to warfare and servitude in the Old Testament, as well as matters of, like the question of the unevangelized, the problem of evil, the matter of faith and science. So we've got a number of top flight scholars working on chapters in these. So anyway, that's another project. I've got co-editing a book, Two Views on Hell, from different perspectives, different disciplines, I should say. And then another book on working on a revision of my book, True for You, But Not for Me. So these are some of the projects that are in the works.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Copan, thank you so much for joining us on Church Coffee and joining me for a little extended Q&A. Really appreciate taking time out of your day, especially when it's hurricane season down there in Florida. So I hope you're staying dry and out of the way. But thank you so much. And I will certainly be looking forward to hopefully meeting or seeing you in person in 2024.
Sounds good. Look forward to it. Thanks so much, Rob.
Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.